My mom declared. We contacted the venue and shut it all down. That man isn't right for you. Dad chimed in. The deposit was non-refundable, so you're welcome. Then the venue manager phoned. Miss Thornton, someone saying she's your mother attempted to cancel your event on your property. Do you want security involved? We picked up the phone and called the venue to cancel everything, and my mom confidently declared that the woman I was marrying wasn't right for me, while my dad chimed in to say the deposit couldn't be refunded anyway, so they were basically doing me a favor by saving money. Not long after that, the venue manager called me directly and said someone claiming to be my mother had tried to cancel an event at a property I personally owned, asking if security needed to be notified. That call came in while I was sitting at my desk, flipping through contracts, and the professional edge in the manager's voice immediately made my stomach tighten. He apologized for interrupting my day and explained that a strange situation had come up involving a woman who identified herself as my mother, and demanded the cancellation of my wedding scheduled for the following month, and apparently she was extremely persistent. I tightened my grip on the phone and asked him to repeat himself because I honestly thought I'd misheard. He confirmed she had called about an hour earlier, insisted everything be cancelled, and got visibly angry when told only I could authorize that decision, ranting about rescuing me from a horrible mistake and mentioning a non-refundable deposit. After a short pause, he added that since I owned the Riverside estate, the whole thing struck them as especially concerning and asked whether they should take extra security precautions. The irony hit me hard because my parents had just tried to shut down my wedding at a venue I bought and rebuilt myself 3 years earlier, something they had no idea about since no one in my family knew I owned it. I thanked him for contacting me directly, told him to add extra security measures, and said I'd be making changes to the guest list. Once the call ended, I sat frozen in my chair, stunned by the nerve of it all, though deep down I knew I shouldn't have been surprised because this kind of control had followed me my entire adult life. Growing up as the youngest son in the Carter family meant every move I made was watched and judged, with my parents planning out my future before I was even old enough to vote, deciding which schools I should attend, who I should associate with, and what career I was supposed to pursue. When I chose hospitality management instead of law school, the disappointment in the house was thick, and when I started investing in real estate at 25 rather than joining the family firm, they called it irresponsible. Now at 32, I'd built a strong portfolio of event properties across the state, with the Riverside estate being the crown jewel, a historic mansion I pulled out of foreclosure and turned into the most in-demand wedding venue in the region. The renovation took a year and a half and nearly wiped out my savings, but the final result was incredible, with crystal chandeliers, restored hardwood floors, and gardens that looked like something out of a storybook. My parents knew I worked in event planning, but they assumed I was still managing other people's properties and barely scraping by, because admitting the truth would mean admitting I'd succeeded on my own, and that wasn't something they were ready to face. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother saying dinner was at 6 and that we needed to talk about my terrible judgment, all for my own good, and I felt anger flare up as I read it. My fiancée, Emily Brooks, was an amazing woman, someone I'd met 2 years earlier when her brother hired me to plan an anniversary party, and she was a structural engineer with calm confidence and an awful sense of humor that somehow made me laugh every day. She treated me like an equal, supported my ambitions, and never tried to mold me into someone else, but none of that mattered to my parents. What bothered them was that her family wasn't wealthy or well-connected. Her dad was a retired mail carrier, her mom worked as a nurse, she drove a practical car, loved hiking more than fancy clubs, and had zero interest in the social circles my parents obsessed over, which made her, in their eyes, not good enough for me. The dinner invite was obviously a setup, since they'd already tried to cancel my wedding behind my back, and now wanted to scold me face to face. The old version of me would have shown up and taken it just to keep the peace, but that guy disappeared after the third time they sabotaged my career decisions. Instead, I forwarded the venue manager's message to my lawyer, Daniel Reeves, with a short note about possible harassment, and then I called Emily. She answered cheerfully, asking how my day was going, and I told her it had gotten interesting because my parents had tried to cancel our wedding. After a long pause, she carefully said she was going to need a little more explanation, so I walked her through the call from the venue and the text from my mother demanding dinner. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the many reasons I loved her, and when I finished she asked what I wanted to do and said she was fine with whatever I chose, even joking that we could elope the next day if I wanted. I told her no, that we were having our wedding exactly as planned at my venue with everyone who mattered. But it was time my parents learned a few truths they'd been avoiding. When she said she was listening, I asked how she'd feel about moving up the rehearsal dinner and making it a bit more elaborate, and I could hear her smiling as she said she had no idea what I was plotting but was fully on board. Over the next few days I put everything in motion, scheduling the rehearsal dinner at the Riverside estate 2 weeks before the wedding and sending formal invitations to my parents, my older brother Lucas, his wife Erin, Emily's family, close friends, and a few business partners who helped me rebuild the property. My mother called the day after she got the invitation, complaining that a rehearsal dinner at that venue was over the top and accusing me of wasting money I didn't have on a marriage doomed to fail, insisting she and my father only tried to cancel it because they loved me, and even saying the venue manager had been rude and should be reported. I calmly told her I'd consider that and asked if she planned to attend, and she said of course because someone had to stop me from ruining my life. The next morning I met Lucas for coffee at a downtown cafe we'd been going to since college, and the fact that he drove 3 hours just to talk told me how seriously he was taking it. He said he couldn't believe they actually tried to cancel my wedding, reminding me how they once tried to block his college enrollment because they didn't approve of his major, and when I mentioned how he'd had to threaten legal action to get them to back off, he nodded and added that when Erin came into his life, they spent months accusing her of chasing family money, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe it. It didn't matter that Mark's family actually had more money than ours ever would, because my parents' real issue was that they couldn't stand losing control of the story they wanted to tell. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, letting the heat sink in, and asked how she finally got them to back off. She told me she moved across the state and limited contact to emails only, birthday cards and holiday messages, nothing meaningful, and eventually they understood she was serious about keeping her distance. She paused and looked at me closely before saying she could tell I was planning something different, and I admitted the rehearsal dinner was going to be eye-opening for everyone because I was done with them thinking I was barely scraping by thanks to my so-called bad decisions. Rachel smiled wide and said it was about time, reminding me they'd underestimated me since I was 15 and told our dad I didn't want to join the family business, and she encouraged me to show them exactly what I'd built. After coffee, I headed back to the estate to check on the final details, and Linda met me in the main office, which used to be a library and now had floor-to-ceiling shelves and a huge oak desk I'd restored myself. She told me there had been another development and handed me a note saying my mother had called again that morning asking if we offered family discounts for the rehearsal dinner, because she assumed I was paying the regular rates. I laughed and asked what she'd told her, and Linda said she explained pricing wasn't negotiable and any special arrangements would have to go through the property owner directly, adding that my mother didn't take that very well and made comments about venues being more accommodating to valued clients. I told her I was sure she did and filed the message with the others before asking if catering was locked in, and Linda confirmed everything was triple-checked, with Chef Anthony personally handling the menu and excited to show off new seasonal dishes. She ran through the rest of the schedule on her tablet, telling me the florist arrival time was set, and the string lights had been tested twice, so everything was right on track. As I walked through the rooms, I found myself amazed all over again by how far the place had come, because when I first toured it as a foreclosure, the mansion was a wreck with water-damaged ceilings, wild overgrown gardens and broken windows everywhere. Even so, beneath all that neglect I could see the potential, and buying it scared the hell out of me because I liquidated all my investments, took penalties pulling from retirement accounts, and signed a personal loan that made my accountant nervous. If my parents had known, they would have said I'd lost my mind, and even Rachel had worried about the risk, but the location was perfect, close enough to the city while still feeling secluded, and the architecture was beautiful, a mix of Victorian elegance and smart design that would photograph perfectly. What really sold me was that nothing else like it existed nearby, since every other venue was either a bland hotel ballroom or a rough barn, and I knew this could be something special. The renovation pushed me harder than anything ever had, forcing me to learn blueprints, negotiate with contractors who underestimated me, and handle problems I never expected, like tracking down period-correct materials to satisfy the Historical Society or working extra hours at my day job, when the plumbing turned out worse than predicted. There were nights I sat alone in the stripped-down ballroom surrounded by debris, wondering if I'd ruined my life, arguing with contractors who wanted shortcuts I wouldn't accept, and hearing no from banks that didn't believe in my plan. But I kept going out of stubborn pride, a need to prove myself and a real love for the property. Each finished room felt like winning a battle. And the first time I stood under the completed chandeliers with sunlight pouring through clean windows, I actually cried. My parents never asked about any of it, and on the rare occasions they asked about my work, I'd mention being busy with a big project, only for them to change the subject to Rachel's accomplishments or their latest charity event, completely missing the fact that I was thriving. Andrew was the first person who really saw what I'd created, and when his sister hired me for her anniversary party, he showed up early and quietly walked through the rooms for 20 minutes before telling me I'd built the entire place, not as a question but a statement. When I asked how he knew, he explained that the design had a consistent personality that only came from one vision, and his sister had mentioned I owned it, not just managed it, which led to coffee, then dinner, and eventually 2 years of the healthiest relationship I'd ever known. Andrew never downplayed my success or tried to steer my goals, helping me analyze projections when I worried about expanding too fast, and celebrating every win like it was his own. His proposal was simple and perfect, just the two of us on the terrace at sunset. No performance, no pressure, just him asking if I wanted to build a life together the same way I built my business, with intention, effort, and partnership. My parents reacted exactly how I expected, with my mother probing into his background and my father quietly digging for flaws, and when they found nothing scandalous, just a good man from a regular family, the disappointment was obvious. Over lunch one day, my mother told me I could do better, framing it as concern, saying I was still young enough to attract someone with more connections, and I calmly set down my fork and told her Andrew was kind, successful, and treated me with respect, asking what else really mattered, only for her to sigh and say ambition and matching backgrounds were important as she delicately sipped her wine. She said he was fine for dating but that marriage was about building a legacy, and of course I understood that, or at least that's what she assumed, and the irony of it all nearly made me laugh because she was lecturing me about ambition while being completely blind to the business I'd built from nothing. I knew trying to explain it would mean forcing them to admit they'd been wrong about me for years, and they weren't ready for that. So instead I let it go and focused on planning my wedding exactly how Andrew and I wanted it. Every choice we made was about us, not about pleasing our families, from vendors we actually liked to invitations that felt like us and a guest list built on real relationships instead of social politics. My parents still had something to say about everything, naturally, complaining that the invitations were too casual, the menu too daring, the ceremony time inconvenient, and most of all that the venue was an irresponsible expense that proved I didn't understand money. My dad even mentioned during one call that the Riverside estate charged premium rates and accused me of throwing cash away on pointless luxury, saying a simple ceremony would mean just as much and be far more sensible. I nodded along, gave vague answers, and kept moving forward, perfectly fine letting them think I was reckless because the truth would be far more satisfying. Daniel had been a huge help through all of this, not just legally but emotionally, since he understood how toxic family dynamics could get after his own parents cut him off when he came out in college. He warned me they'd escalate once they realized they were losing control, and when I told him about the rehearsal dinner plan, he said people like that don't handle losing power quietly and to expect retaliation. I told him that was exactly what I was counting on, because I'd rather force the confrontation now on my terms than deal with years of interference in my marriage, and he agreed, reminding me to document everything and save every message just in case. That advice paid off almost immediately, because after the venue manager called about the cancellation attempt, my mother followed up with a string of emails that went from claiming it was all a misunderstanding to insisting Andrew was manipulating me to demanding I call her immediately about my alarming behavior, and I saved every single one without replying. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, Rachel called to warn me that Mom had been telling people at her country club that I was having a nervous breakdown, blaming wedding stress and claiming I'd become paranoid and irrational, with friends even asking if I was getting professional help. I wasn't surprised at all and said as much, because if she couldn't admit she crossed a line, then obviously the problem had to be me. Rachel said the story was detailed too, with Mom claiming I was obsessed with the wedding, blowing money I didn't have to impress Andrew's family, and that Dad tried to calmly talk to me about budgeting and I'd screamed at him, and her tone made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. She just wanted me to know what I was walking into, and when I asked if she was still coming, she said she wouldn't miss it for anything and joked that her husband Mark was bringing popcorn and spirit. The night before the dinner, Andrew found me in the garden pretending to inspect the landscaping when I was really just trying to settle my nerves, and he asked if I was having second thoughts as he sat beside me on the stone bench. I told him never about us but wondered out loud if I should just let things go and keep the peace instead of making waves, And he calmly pointed out that I could do that if I wanted and spend the rest of my life managing their expectations and interference, or I could draw a line and mean it. I joked about when he got so wise, and he said he'd had a good teacher, kissing my head and reminding me I'd taught him a lot about standing up for yourself, and he was right. I'd spent too many years chasing approval I was never going to get, and the attempted wedding cancellation made it painfully clear my parents didn't respect my independence, so all that was left was to follow through. The rehearsal dinner night arrived with perfect weather, the gardens glowing under thousands of string lights that made the whole place feel unreal, and the catering team delivered an elegant meal that showed off local ingredients beautifully. My parents showed up right on time, polished as always, with my dad wearing authority like a tailored jacket, and my mom scanning the place with that sharp, judgmental look she'd perfected over decades. She admitted the property was lovely but still hinted I was wasting money and asked if I'd considered a smaller ceremony better suited to my budget, just as Andrew stepped beside me in a navy suit and greeted them politely. My dad gave him a stiff nod, my mom barely acknowledged him, and then Rachel arrived with Mark, hugging me and whispering that the place was stunning and I'd done an incredible job, and I told her to wait until she saw the ballroom. As guests mingled with cocktails, I played the gracious host while my parents held court near the fountain, clearly sharing their concerns with anyone who would listen, and I caught my mom's voice drifting across the lawn talking about how impulsive I was and how stubborn I'd always been. Daniel arrived fashionably late, gave me a knowing look over his champagne glass, and asked if I was ready, and I told him absolutely. Dinner was served in the grand ballroom, with my parents seated front and center exactly where I wanted them, and once dessert arrived, I stood and tapped my glass, the room falling quiet as Andrew squeezed my hand under the table in silent support. I thanked everyone for coming and said how much the venue meant to me, explaining that I wanted to spend the evening with the people who truly mattered, then mentioned that while most of them knew I'd worked in event planning for years, there was something I hadn't really shared. I paused long enough to see my mother lean in and my father's face harden with doubt before saying that 3 years earlier I'd made what my parents like to call a reckless financial move, taking everything I'd saved from my so-called average career and buying a foreclosed property. I told them the Riverside estate had been in awful shape but I saw potential, and over the next 18 months I poured everything into it, learning construction management on the fly, building relationships with contractors and vendors, and nearly bankrupting myself in the process because I believed in the vision. I watched my mother's face drain of color as it started to click, and then I explained that today the Riverside estate was the top wedding venue in the region, booked 2 years out with a waiting list, its value up 300%, and yes, since it seemed relevant, I owned it outright with no mortgage, no investors, and no partners. The room went completely silent, my dad's shock replacing his skepticism, Rachel openly grinning, and I continued by saying that when someone recently tried to cancel my wedding at this venue under the excuse of saving me from bad judgment and financial ruin, the manager called me immediately because I wasn't just the groom, I was the owner, and I had very clear rules about who got to make decisions on my property. My mother finally managed to speak, stunned, repeating that I owned all of it, every chandelier, garden path, and restored floorboard, and I told her I also owned 2 other venues across the state and had just closed on a 4th downtown, adding that my supposedly reckless career had actually turned out pretty successful, just not in ways they ever bothered to notice. I turned to Andrew, who was looking at me with nothing but pride, and said he'd supported my business from day one, helping interview vendors, reviewing contracts when I was exhausted, and never once suggesting I should be doing something else with my life, treating me like a capable partner, which apparently wasn't a familiar concept to everyone. My father jumped to his feet, chair scraping loudly, accusing me of deceiving them, and I calmly told him I hadn't deceived anyone. I just built a life without their permission because I learned long ago that nothing I did would ever meet their standards, that they assumed I was failing because my success didn't match their expectations, and that they tried to sabotage my wedding while standing in a building I owned, completely blind to reality. Daniel stepped forward then, pulling documents from his briefcase and formally informing my parents that any future attempts to interfere with events at Riverside or any of my properties would result in trespassing charges, and that they were being removed from the wedding guest list, prompting my mother to gasp that I was uninviting my own parents. I told her they'd done that themselves when they tried to cancel my wedding behind my back, that this was simply the consequence of their choices, that they'd be refunded any expenses, but they wouldn't be attending my wedding or interfering in my life anymore. Rachel stood and raised her glass to me, calling me brilliant and congratulating me on building an empire while everyone underestimated me, And the room erupted in applause as Andrew pulled me close and kissed my temple, my parents sitting frozen as the truth finally sank in. My father tried one last time, insisting they were my parents and I couldn't just cut them out, and I told him to watch me, explaining I'd given them years of chances to see me for who I really was and they chose not to, and now they had to live with that. They left soon after, my mother crying and my father furious, Rachel hugging me tightly and telling me she was proud and wished she'd done this years ago, and I told her it was never too late to set boundaries. The rest of the night was pure joy, with Andrew's parents warmly celebrating the venue, friends and colleagues congratulating me on both the business and the backbone I showed, and Daniel confirming everything legally was solid. Later, when it was just Andrew and me on the terrace under the glowing string lights, he asked if I had any regrets, and after honestly considering the family fallout ahead, I told him none at all, that I was done letting them make me feel like I wasn't enough and that our wedding would happen exactly as planned with people who truly supported us. He told me he thought I was extraordinary and the strongest person he knew, and I leaned into him saying I'd had good motivation because he showed me what it felt like to be with someone who didn't want to change me, making it impossible to ever accept less again. In the days after, the fallout hit fast, with my mother calling nonstop and leaving voicemails that went from confusion to rage to guilt trips about my father's health, all accusing me of humiliating them, and I saved every message just like Daniel advised, recognizing the manipulation for what it was and feeling oddly grounded knowing I finally had it documented. Rachel told me the family rumor machine was in full swing, and according to what she'd been hearing, our parents were telling relatives that I'd completely lost it at the rehearsal dinner, claiming I'd had some kind of public breakdown, made outrageous accusations, and caused a huge scene while conveniently leaving out the part where I revealed I owned a very successful business. She said Aunt Marlene had called her that morning asking if I was on medication and whether I needed some sort of intervention, because Mom had been working overtime pushing her version of the story. I surprised myself by shrugging it off and saying to let them talk, because anyone who actually knew me would see through it, and anyone who didn't know me well enough to question it probably wasn't worth my energy. The truth was that rehearsal dinner had been freeing in a way I hadn't expected, because for the first time in my adult life I stopped performing for my parents' approval and just stated facts, drew boundaries, and refused to let myself be talked down to, and while the fallout wasn't comfortable, the alternative of letting them keep treating me like I was incompetent had finally become impossible. The day after the dinner, Andrew's parents reached out with a message that hit me hard while I was sitting at my desk, his mom writing that they were proud of everything I'd built and honored to be welcoming me into their family, saying the business and the backbone it took to stand up for myself were both remarkable, and that they couldn't wait to celebrate our wedding and support us however they could. What struck me most was how Andrew's family accepted me for who I was, not for how I made them look or what I could offer socially, and instead of being threatened by my success, they genuinely celebrated it. I threw myself into the final stretch of wedding planning with a new sense of purpose, focused on creating something that reflected our values instead of anyone else's expectations. And I revised the guest list to remove not just my parents but several of their friends who'd only been invited out of obligation. In their place, I invited people who had actually shown up for me over the years, former colleagues who believed in my vision, vendors who worked alongside me during the renovation, and friends who'd been there when things were hard. The ceremony itself evolved into something that felt fully ours, without the traditional religious elements my parents had always assumed we'd include, and Andrew and I wrote our own vows centered on partnership, respect, and building a life rooted in mutual support. We chose music we loved, even a few songs that would have made my mother cringe, and designed the whole atmosphere to feel warm and inviting instead of stiff and intimidating. Linda, the venue manager, had been an incredible ally through all of it, and while she dealt with difficult families before, she told me my situation stood out, saying she'd seen controlling parents plenty of times but trying to cancel a wedding behind the owner's back at their own property was on another level of entitlement. I told her that in my parents' minds they truly believed they were protecting me from my own bad judgment, and that the reality of me being a successful business owner with solid financial instincts simply didn't register for them. And she pointed out that their loss was everyone else's gain because the wedding was going to be unforgettable and people would talk. She was right, because in the 2 weeks between the rehearsal dinner and the wedding, word spread about the venue owner who publicly uninvited his own parents, and while some people thought I'd gone too far and others applauded the boundary, everyone was talking, which led to an unexpected spike in booking requests. Linda showed me consultation emails from brides dealing with difficult families who said they wanted a venue where the owner actually understood complex dynamics and would protect their decisions, with several specifically mentioning the rehearsal dinner and saying they felt I'd have their backs too. It was strangely moving to see my personal drama turn into something positive, drawing in clients who valued autonomy, respect, and the right to make their own choices. One bride in particular, a woman I renamed Claire Monroe for privacy, told me during her consultation that she'd spent years dealing with a controlling mother and needed a venue that wouldn't secretly take orders from whoever wrote the check. And when she heard I'd legally blocked my own parents from interfering, she knew I'd understand, and I booked her wedding immediately because I recognized that kind of spirit. 3 days before my wedding, my parents made one last attempt to force a reconciliation by showing up at the estate without warning, dressed formally and clearly expecting a dramatic confrontation, but Linda met them at the entrance and calmly told them, as previously explained through their attorney, they weren't allowed on the property without explicit permission and needed to leave. When my father protested and claimed parental rights, she coolly corrected him and said if they didn't leave on their own she'd call local law enforcement, and those were their only options. I watched from my office window as my mother dabbed at her eyes and my father stood red-faced with anger, and while a small part of me wanted to rush down and smooth things over, that instinct was getting weaker by the day. They eventually left, my father theatrically guiding my mother to the car as if she couldn't walk on her own, and that evening Rachel called to check on me, asking if I was okay after hearing about the failed ambush. I told her honestly that I felt relieved more than anything, like I'd finally been given permission to stop trying to fix something that was never my responsibility to fix, and she told me that was healthy and reminded me I hadn't broken the relationship, I just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. 2 weeks later, the wedding itself was everything we hoped for, with Rachel standing beside me as my best woman, Andrew's sister as a bridesmaid, and his father walking me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, honored to be there for parents who chose not to attend. We were married in the garden at sunset in front of 200 guests chosen for their real importance in our lives, and my parents sent a short card afterward expressing disappointment and hoping I'd reconsider, which I quietly filed away without responding, knowing some bridges have to burn all the way down before you can build something better in their place. During the reception, Linda, the venue manager who'd played a huge role in turning the estate into what it was, pulled me aside and told me she wanted me to know we'd already gotten 3 new inquiries that week from people who'd heard about what happened at the rehearsal dinner, all talking about a venue owner who uninvited his own parents, and saying they respected the boundaries, and wanted to work with someone who understood that family situations can get messy. I laughed, honestly surprised, and said that was strangely heartwarming, and Linda just shrugged and said people respond to authenticity, that standing up for myself and my business clearly struck a chord. Later, as I danced with Andrew surrounded by people who truly cared about our happiness, I realized how light I felt, like years of pressure had finally slipped off my shoulders, the constant weight of trying to earn my parents' approval and prove I deserved basic respect finally gone. My mother called about 2 months after the wedding and I let it go to voicemail. Then she called again the next week and followed that with an email suggesting we move past the unpleasantness, which I quietly archived without replying. Rachel told me our parents were still telling relatives I'd had some sort of breakdown and that wedding stress had made me irrational, and I honestly didn't care because I was busy running a successful business, enjoying married life, and planning renovations on my newest property, and their version of my life had never really matched reality anyway. About 6 months after the wedding, I sent them a short letter, not exactly a peace offering, but a clear list of terms, explaining that if they wanted any relationship with me, it would require respecting my autonomy, my career, and my marriage to Andrew with no more control, no more dismissive remarks, and no more attempts to interfere. They never replied, and Rachel later said they'd read it together over breakfast and then switched the topic to something about the country club, which was when it finally clicked that some people would rather lose their children than admit they were wrong. Andrew and I celebrated our first anniversary at the Riverside estate with a small dinner party in the same ballroom where I'd finally stood up for myself, and by then the property was thriving, winning industry awards, attracting high-profile clients, and supporting a growing staff, with me even teaching workshops to other aspiring venue owners. Standing there watching people we loved celebrate with us, I thought back to that original phone call from the venue manager, the moment I realized my parents valued control more than a relationship with me, and the choice I made to stop chasing approval I was never going to get. Andrew showed up beside me with 2 glasses of champagne and asked what I was thinking about, And I told him how one phone call had changed everything, because if Linda hadn't called me directly, I might have walked into that dinner ready to apologize for existing wrong, but she did call, he said, and I didn't apologize, and now look at what we'd built together. I corrected him gently and said we built it because I couldn't have done any of this without him, and he smiled and said I could have, that I was capable of anything, but he was grateful I let him be part of it. That was the real difference, I realized, because Andrew saw my strength and celebrated it instead of trying to control it, trusted my judgment instead of assuming he knew better, while my parents spent my entire life trying to shape me into someone else and then tried to sabotage the life I built when I refused. The attempted wedding cancellation wasn't the betrayal, it was the proof, and I didn't win by hurting them or getting revenge, but by choosing myself, protecting my boundaries, building my business, marrying the man I loved, and creating a life that made me genuinely happy. Their approval stopped matching the moment I believed in myself, and the Riverside estate keeps hosting weddings every weekend, each one celebrating two people choosing to build a life together. And if I ever think about the parents who tried to cancel my own wedding at the very place I created, it's only to appreciate how far I've come since I stopped needing their permission, because some deposits really aren't refundable, some bridges are meant to burn, and some victories aren't loud at all. They're found in the quiet satisfaction of knowing you became exactly who you were meant to be.